Chapter 11. Charo leads again. The branding of the colts had been done just in good time, or as Virginia wondered, was it only a test as to how good the brands would hold, when one fine morning, a week or so after the branding, and going into the pasture to get her saddle horses, she couldn't see hide nor hair of either Colonel or Charo. Then looking down the pasture and seeing one of the new pole gates with the foolproof latches opened, she didn't have to guess twice as to what had happened. Them two colts with Charo leading had hit it out again. But as she got the remaining saddle horses in the corral and caught the one she wanted, she found there was one of them missing. This was an old gray pensioner that hadn't been rode for years and had been brought in to be doctored for distemper. He'd been turned in the pasture with a few saddle horses to recuperate on the green feed for a few days before he'd be turned out again. That old gray had been the only one missing along with the colts, and knowing as Virginia did where he ranged, she had high hopes as she started out after the runaways that she'd soon catch up with 'em. For one thing, they didn't have more than one night's start, and figuring the colts would sure be with the gray, it would be just a nice day's ride getting 'em. So sure was she of finding the colts with the gray that she didn't look for their tracks after going through the last ranch gate, but rode straight on and at a good clip. For the gray's range, Virginia knew that range well, every horse on it and where each one or bunch run, and it didn't surprise her any when along near noon she seen the gray about a mile ahead of her, just grazing along slow and towards his range, which was still some distance further on. It didn't bother her none that she didn't see the two darker ones, Colonel and Charo, for being that country was very hilly, them two could be somewhere close by the gray, in some ravine, or where she couldn't see them until she rode nearer. But she was due for disappointment, for as she rode nearer the gray, she soon seen he was very much alone. The gray sort of sprinted around at the sight of her, more like a 3-year-old wild one than the 30-year-old pensioned cow horse he was. Throwed up his head and tail, snorted and whistled loud, and then hit out cross country, like as if all damnation was after him, for his range, and at a speed that would have bothered Virginia's good horse to follow. Virginia just watched the old gray go, and her hopes at seeing the colts faded right then, for if they'd been anywhere close to the gray, they'd sure come out of wherever they was at, acted wild too, and followed him. They'd at least showed up to see what all he was running about. Now, as she sat her horse, watching the running gray in the distance, she knew then that the colts hadn't followed him very far out from the ranch. There was now only one thing for her to do, and that was turn back and cut for their tracks, above where she figured they'd most likely left the gray. But there again, as she rode, it came to her of the fall before, how they'd both been found away on the other side of the ranch, and not at all like from the Badlands, which was far on this side of it. As it was, they might be working around the ranch to get on the other side, but if so, she'd be bound to come across their tracks anyway, where they left off from the grays. She was riding slow, watching for them tracks now, and she was pleased when she finally come across them, but they wasn't heading like to circle around the ranch and get on the other side of it, as she'd expected. Instead, they was going for the horse range and towards the Badlands beyond. It was now middle afternoon, but Virginia rode on along the familiar tracks for quite a ways until she come to a deep water hole, and there, with so many fresh tracks of other horses that had come to water, she lost the ones of the colts, but she had the general direction of where they was headed, and would have circled on further to find the tracks again, but it was getting late. There was a long 20-mile ride back to the ranch, and she turned back. She'd be on their trail again early the next morning. It was away after dark when she got back to the ranch. Her dad and Ann had waited up for her, and while Virginia was easing her appetite, her dad told her how he'd figured the gates to be opened and the colts getting out. Virginia had been doing plenty of wondering about that herself. That old renegade gray, old white cloud, is one to blame for them gates being opened, Cal grinned. I looked good for shoe or boot tracks around 'em after you left, and there wasn't any but yours. But there was plenty of old white clouds. I can tell his old pigeon-toed tracks easy. And I could see that he done a lot of stomping around the gate and studying of ways to work the foolproof patent so's to open it. Old White Cloud is no fool, and as I got to thinking and remembering, that old wise one used to sort of take pride in opening gates with all sorts of different fixings on 'em, and letting the stock out, even if sometimes he didn't care to go himself. There was only one kind of fixing on a gate I figure he couldn't open, and that was when it was chained and locked. I wouldn't have been too surprised if he'd worked even that. Yep, after investigating all around, asking all the help on the ranch, and everything, I'm sure that old White Cloud is the culprit. The ranch blacksmith here who invented that rigging thinks I'm crazy, but when I get that old white devil in again sometime I'll prove it to him. He's the one who can sure work that foolproof gate patent of his. Virginia couldn't help but laugh a little with her dad at his telling of old White Cloud's wisdom in opening gates. Yes, she said, but if he's the guilty one, don't you ever have him in the same pasture with Colonel and Charo again, or any other horse we want to keep close to home. I sure won't, Cal said, still chuckling some, but I never thought, or I mean I'd forgot, about that old scalawag's tricks. You see, it's been about 10 years since I stopped riding him, and a feller can forget quite a few things in that time, but not with that wise old walloper. I don't know how he learned such freaky tricks. He never was no pet. If he was, I wouldn't think so much of it, but he was born and raised in the hills, was a tough one to break, and you could hardly lead him into a barn even during the worst of weather, and right today I'll bet he'd still do a good job of bucking. No, sir, I can't figure out that gate-opening streak of his, but now there was the getting of the colts back again, and that wouldn't be easy. They now had 24 hours start, would be traveling right along and take only short spells to graze now and again, and that way they'd be many more hours in the lead before they could be caught up to wherever they was headed, and that's where would be the puzzle, where they'd be headed. It was early light the next morning when Virginia rode out for the horse range, where she'd lost trail of the colts the day before. There was, of course, more fresh horse tracks by then, tracks of all sizes, from few-day-old colts to the size of full-grown horses, and it would be near impossible to trail Colonel and Charo on through them, but knowing from the day before the general direction they'd taken, she looked through only a few bunches of the range horses that was closest. Then after going through the horse range, she made a sort of half-circle, cutting for their tracks, and to her pleasure she found them again, but also to her surprise them tracks led straight on for the Badlands, and not at all circling around the ranch to where the colts had been found the fall before, where she'd believed was Charo's range, and now with the Badlands to ride into or cross to wherever they might be headed for, that would be a man-sized job, a good man who knew that country and mounted on a mighty good horse. Virginia took pride in being all woman. She respected and never tried to do whatever was really a man's job, and she knew that hitting them Badlands was a sure enough man's job, not any man's, but one who knew what he was about and what to do when he got in them and found the colts. Brad would be the man, but he was away again with the bucking stock and following the rodeos. The contracts for the stock and with his contesting would keep him away until late in the fall. There was one good old cowboy at one of the camps who might do, but her dad had plenty of use for him. The other two cowboys was good men, too, but mostly with regular cow work, and there's quite some difference between that and wild horse running. And wild horse running it would be because, as Virginia figured, the colts would soon get with the wild ones and then be as hard to catch. She would talk that over with her dad. Before turning her horse back for the ranch that day, Virginia, wanting to make sure of the colts rambling, followed their trail plumb up to the Badlands, and quite a ways into 'em. She could see that their tracks was over a day old, also was sure they'd kept going right on. To catch up with 'em, she'd have to stay in the Badlands that night and hit on their trail. Again at the light of dawn. Even then she knew she'd lost their trail in stony or wind-blown places, and if she did catch up with 'em, they'd most likely be with some wild bunch by then, and if so, she knew there'd be no more catching Colonel, much less Charo, unless she got 'em cornered, alone or in a trap. Then again there was her horse, a very good horse, but she'd come a long roundabout way that day, and he was now ganted up and tired, also thirsty. Grass was in mighty scattering patches everywheres around, and there was no water. She'd have to hobble him and take big chances of losing him. The thought of being left afoot in that country didn't strike her as at all pleasant. Besides, she was some hungry herself, not having et since daybreak that morning, thirsty too, and she knew better than drink water from them Badlands, if she did find some. So, all in all, it more and more struck her as a full-sized man's job, a hardened Mustang runner's, to go on in that country and catch up with the colts. But she'd only wanted to make sure as to which way the colts had gone, and if they'd kept a-goin'. And now that she was satisfied as to that, she turned her horse back for the ranch, and in as straight a course as her horse would take. It was plenty steep at times. The light was still burning in the main room of the house when she got there that night, and her dad and Anne was still sort of up and waiting for her. That is, they hadn't lost much sleep at doing that. Her dad, his boots and all but his hat still on, was stretched out on the davenport, while Anne had made herself just as comfortable in his pet overstuffed chair, the kind with a footrest that springs out from underneath, and a back that can be adjusted to any incline. Both had been asleep until Virginia opened the door and walked in. Her dad was the first to set up and blink at her. Then, rubbing his eyes, he grinned. "Well, good morning, daughter." Anne didn't say anything, but just sort of jumped up, smiled at her, and hit for the kitchen, and paying no attention to Virginia asking her not to bother, that she didn't want anything. She went right on rattling the stove lids and stirring up a fire, remarking the while that she'd have the coffee and things all hot and ready for her in a jiffy. "Well, if that's the case," Cal says, now full awake, "I think I'll have my coffee and a little breakfast now, being you're at it. I'll soon be daybreak, and I've sure had all the sleep I wanted." But he added on, looking at the girl, "Better take care of Virginia first. She must be powerful tired and hungry." Virginia sat in the chair Anne had just left and smiled. "I am tired," she smiled on. "I think I'll be able to sleep too." "I should think so." Anne chips in from the kitchen door. "Come, pull your boots off, bathe your face a little, and by that time I'll have everything on the table for you. You'll rest better after you eat a little something." Cal stood up, stretched, and walked outside, took a few lungsful of the early morning air, sat down on the edge of the big porch and rolled a smoke. "Doggone that ridge-running colonel," he says, after the first puff. "I'll bet he's going to be hard to get this time, and Brad and Red gone too." He thought on for a while. He didn't want Virginia to worry and ride herself and her horses ragged for that colt as she had the year before. She'd sure do it again too, and here he of a sudden thought of a way of relieving her of that, of somebody who'd sure get him and quick, that is, quick as any other could. He went back in the house, all smiles and remarking that this early morning air sure made a feller feel good. "Better than all night air, ain't it?" he says, grinning at Virginia, who by then had got into a house dress and felt some refreshed. Anne soon brought in a pot of steaming coffee, followed by a regular hot breakfast, and the three sat down to it. The talk was up in the air for a spell until after a second cup of coffee, and then Virginia spoke up of her long ride. She didn't have to tell of her failure in finding the colts, but as she said, she did know for sure where they'd went before she turned back, and that was away into the Badlands. That was a plenty to satisfy Cal. He didn't ask no questions and gave her no advice as to what she should have done. Instead, he only remarked that she'd made a powerful big ride for a little girl like that, or even for a big man, and that she'd done fine in finding their tracks again and knowing for sure which country they went into. "That will help a considerable," he said, as he got up from the table. "And listen, young lady," he went on, pointing a finger at her, "I want you to stay home today and rest up. I'll relieve you of hunting for them colts, and if the way I do don't suit you, why, you can take up the trail where I left off. Now catch yourself a nap and let your saddle rest." With that last and light pat on her cheek, he picked up his jacket, and out the door he went, saying, "I'll be back tonight." The two women looked at one another, wondering. As Cal went out the door, it was still hardly daybreak, and they wondered some more when, a few minutes later, they heard the purr of his big car, and then, looking out the window, seen the headlights of it headed for the main road a mile away, the main one leading to town. It was all very mysterious. Anne turned to Virginia. "Why," she says in surprise, "looks like he's going to town. That's not the direction the colts would be, and besides, how would he catch 'em in a car?" Virginia only smiled. "He's not going after the colts," Anne said. "Not right now, anyway." but you can be sure he's got some good scheme of getting 'em. We might find out what it is when he gets back, and right now I'm going to catch up on some sleep and rest, as he and you said for me to do." The womenfolk would have wondered plenty more if along before noon that same day they'd seen Cal drive into the county seat, straight up to the courthouse and into that building. Then again, when he planked down $2,000 in cash for bail money to release one bewhiskered but smiling small man from behind the bars of the cell block there, them womenfolk would have thought it mighty mysterious then too, for this small man of around 30 was none other than the well-known horse thief and mustang runner, Blackie Cooper. He'd been arrested by stock inspectors a few weeks before for mixing and trying to ship branded horses not belonging to him along with some mustangs he'd caught. He'd of course worked the brands over, but not quite well enough to get by the wise eye of one of the inspectors who one time had been quite an artist at that himself. Besides, there was one especial horse that was a dead giveaway, regardless of the well-changed brand on him, for an inspector knew that horse well, also the man who owned him. Anyway, Blackie would be locked up. He wouldn't plead guilty. So the stiff bail was set, and now the trial would not be before that fall. He'd had to pace his cell for the long months up to that time, because neither him nor his two pardoners, who was still out in the hills with the saddle horses, could have put up nowheres near such an amount as $2,000 to get him out on bail. He had no other friends he could call onto for any such an amount. Then Cal, having heard of his predicament, came along. It struck Blackie queer he'd never thought of Cal. He'd rode for him for quite a while, some years before, when Cal still had some of his racing stock, and the both had thought a lot of one another. He'd rode longer than for Cal, but when Cal finally lost all his racing stock, with only a few saddle horses left, and having to go back to riding after cattle, why Blackie had quit. Cattle was too slow for him, no matter how wild they might be. He was used to horses. He'd like to train them racing colts of cows, and even though raised on and used two-range horses, he was a good hand with them thoroughbreds. Cal came near taking him along as a jockey a couple of times, but there'd been always some new colts for him to take care of. Blackie would have been a mighty good jockey too, for along with knowing as much as he did about horses, he also had the good jockey weight, light and wiry. When Cal lost his horses, Blackie lost heart and went back to running wild ones, what he'd been raised at doing. He run and caught many wild horses in different western states, and worked for horse outfits in between times, but never for cow outfits, and there was one man Blackie rode for and never stole a horse from. That man was Cal, and Cal knew and appreciated that. Now he was showing his appreciation, not only for that, which maybe didn't call for appreciation, but Cal needed him. There was no better mustang runner in that country, and he needed him to get that Colonel colt back for Virginia. Cal knew that with Charo's lead hitting for the Badlands, them two was headed for the wild horse country, which was beyond. He knew that they'd soon join some wild bunch there, and that then Colonel would be as hard or maybe harder to get near than any of the wild ones, and Blackie, he figured, was about the only man who could maneuver to catch him. If Colonel was with a bunch of wild ones, he'd have to catch that bunch in order to get him. If not, he'd be with Charo, and that little Grula would have to be caught too, which would be just as hard to do, if not harder, than catching a whole bunch. As far as trusting Blackie to deliver Colonel when caught and not to quit the country, leaving Cal loser on the bail money, Cal hardly gave any thought of that. He knew Blackie enough and felt he could well depend on him, more now than ever before. There was no talk about that as the two ate a noon meal at a restaurant. The main talk was of Colonel and getting him. As the talk went on that way, the lay of the country where Colonel might be in, Cal learned that Blackie had been running horses in the same country only the year before, and not only that, but to Cal's surprise, he gave him the description of Colonel and Charo, for Blackie was the same Mustang runner who that year before had caught the 4 young studs of the bunch Colonel and Charo had took up with them and the 2 old renegades. He was the one who'd marveled at Colonel's speed as the 2 broke away and he rode on with the 4 studs, figuring on getting Colonel and Charo on the next day. Well, that made it all easy. He knew the country and the horses he was to get. It would be all easy, but maybe the catching, and Blackie didn't seem to be worried about that. He still had his saddle horses and outfit with his partners. He'd have 2 partners move camp back near that country of Charo's home range, and now all he wanted was a saddle and a good horse till he got to his own. Somebody to show him the trail where at Colonel and Charo went into the Badlands, and he'd do the rest from there on. God Almighty, Mr. Goodwin, Blackie busted out as him and Cal was driving back to the ranch. This is one time when I'm going to be powerful happy, doing something else along with running Mustangs. What something else? Asked Cal, having a sort of hunch. Nell's bells, Cal, you know what I mean. Chapter 12, Winner Takes All. It had been a month since Colonel and Charo had got out of the pasture and away, and then one day a rider came to the Hippo Ranch, leading a saddled horse. It was the horse that Cal had loaned Blackie some 3 weeks before, pretty well rode down, but not hurt in any way, only needing a rest, and the rider was Blackie, looking like he also needed a rest. Him and Cal got together by the corrals that evening. Well, I seen him, he grinned. Yep, I seen him quite a few times, but just streaks of him. Why, man, it'd take the combined speed of 2 of the fastest horses in this country to get close enough for a good look at that brown colt. But I'm sure it was him I seen. I mean the one you call Colonel, and how that colt can and likes to run. The reason I'm sure is because he's still with the little Grula, and that little feller is sure no slouch either, but he's like tied and standing still when that brown unlimbers. Them long legs of his, he'll run big circles around him while the little feller levels out to his best towards wherever he wants to go. But that little feller is the brains of the 2 when it comes to dodging every way of catching him, and his partner sure knows it. That little feller has spotted every blind and water trap there is in the country. He'll never go near one, and as far as to corner him against rims or box canyons so's to get a chance to rope him, why, it'd be foolish to even think of it. Another thing is he's never in same part of the country or runs the same direction twice. On that account, we can't build a trap for him because we wouldn't know if he'd ever run the direction of it, alone get him into it. We all 3 went after him time and again, used every scheme we knew of to get him one way or another, but the wise little devil seemed to see through 'em all and get by every time, the tall one just having a lot of fun with us by making distance the way the little one pointed. We even tried to relay on 'em, the three of us stationed some 10 miles apart, but they'd get away even half-ways before they could be got to the second relay rider. Then we got to thinking we could easy enough trap the tall one if we somehow could get rid of the wise little leader. There'd been only one way of doing that, and that'd been to shoot him, but none of us wanted to do that. We later seen that it wouldn't have been of any use anyway, because there come times when the tall one himself would take turn and be the proud leader of some bunch. One bunch one time and another bunch the next, and even though the little feller would always be in the same bunches with him, that went to show that even without his little partner, the tall one would only fan his tail at us, and soon join up with one of them bunches. He might of course been easier caught than if he got with some bunch, with not so wise a leader as Charo, but it seems like that colonel colt now has took on a lot of little Charo's wisdom, and turning out to be quite some leader himself. He's not the ignorant colt he was last year. He didn't know which way to run then, but now he acts like it's a lot of fun to outrun and outwit a rider. With Charo's, it's all seriousness, near like a matter of life and death in making his getaways. But with Colonel, he just sort of plays with us, and when we get a chance to pocket or crowd him towards a trap, he's up and gone in a puff of dust. Blackie snapped his fingers just like that. "Ha, some horse," grunted Cal. "Sure worth getting. But how do you aim to proceed to do that now, Blackie?" he asked. "The same as I been doing. That's all can be done, and trust to luck for a good chance at that. It would be mostly by pure good luck, and lots of it. A feller never can tell when such a chance might come, but I thought I'd better come over and let you know in case you'd be wondering, and bring your horse and saddle back. I had to use him some, and he's a little leg weary." "That's all right," says Cal. When there's work to be done, then he asked, "How are you doing with the other wild ones? Catching many?" "Pretty good," says Blackie, "and along with staying on Colonel and Charo's trail mostly, and trying to get them, we've caught near enough now to make up 2 carloads." "No more branded ones that you can't answer for, is there?" asked Cal, grinning. Blackie grinned back a little and just said, "No, not for a while anyway." "Now," Cal went on, "as to that horse of mine which you brought back, I noticed that your own horse could use some rest. Better leave him here too, and take a couple of mine for a while. I've got plenty here that sure needs riding. Good tough circle horses that'll do you fine." That went more than well with Blackie, and so the next day Cal went with him to the horse range, drove a bunch into the corrals, and from it picked 2 good fresh ones, leaving the 2 tired ones in their place. As Cal had said, they was plenty tough, not only for long rides, but also on to top off for the start, and little Blackie had to be the rider he was, or he'd never got started. For that didn't seem to bother Blackie much, and after that horse's head came up, ready for travel, Cal handed him the lead rope of the other tough horse, opened the corral gate, and bidding the little rider the best of luck, watched him ride on towards the Badlands, and back to the wild horse country. "Tough and reckless as he's little," Cal remarked, as he closed the corral gate on the remaining horses, which he'd later turn out to drift back to the horse range. Blackie's horse with him. Virginia had again got sort of reconciled at Colonel's running away, only she was some disappointed in him this second time. She hadn't blamed him the first time because he didn't know no better then, but this second time, after all, the winter's good care, being so gentle and behaving so well under the saddle, it was disappointing that he would leave again at the first chance, even though she knew that Charo had led him on, so feeling some peeved at the rascal, she didn't worry so much about him as she had the first time. Then again, she knew where he'd gone, and could now take care of himself. There was a good horse hunter steady out to get him, and being she couldn't do no more, she took it some easier. She was of course mighty glad when that horse hunter Blackie came with the news that he'd seen him often, and that sometime he might catch and bring him back. For encouragement, Cal had made that seem much more possible than it really was or believed himself. Adding on to that, he sort of painted great stories of the wonders and speed of the colt amongst the wild ones, as a great leader and faster than all of 'em. That was of course supposed to be from Blackie's say-so, but he wasn't exaggerating there, and the reason he told her such stories was to at least relieve her of any worries about him. But it done better than that. She felt proud of him, and with her dad's word paintings, she could see him well at the lead of some wild bunch, mane and a tail a-flying, and then would come other thoughts. Would she ever get him back? Her dad couldn't somehow make any convincing word pictures that him being such a horse could ever be caught. Cal had been careful not to tell her of the wild horse cunning the colt had developed. He heard of it off and on as summer wore along, and got to figuring that Colonel was now having too much fun to let himself be caught. Virginia also heard of such goings-on a couple of times that summer, but not from Cal, and as she told him about it one day, he only laughed a little and said, sort of encouragingly to her, as well as to himself, "Don't you worry, that running around he's doing is the best thing for him. If all thoroughbreds had such kind of training to develop on, they'd be much tougher, and still better in every way, footing, endurance, brains, and, well, in every way. Colonel is getting just that, and a lot of fun to boot, not just mechanical-like, grinding and monotonous work, as he'd get in paddocks and tracks like youngsters in schools. His is interesting, where the going is rough and has to use his wits along with his speed. Maybe he won't get caught, but I'll bet you a new saddle, you need one anyway, against one of your cheerful smiles, that when the snows begin blasting on his rump this fall, he'll be drifting in along the fence again, as he did last fall." Virginia had thought of that, and from all she'd heard of his wise ways of dodging loop and traps, she'd come to figure that there was her only hope when snows would come. More so when, one day that fall, before the snows did come, Blackie rode in. It wasn't because he'd given up hopes of catching Colonel, but the months he'd been at trying to in every way proved that when as good a mustang runner as he was had failed in that time, there wasn't much use of any other trying. Virginia knew the reason for Blackie's return, and she admired him for being so true with his word. He'd had plenty of good horses, his own and belongings to go on with, but he'd returned in good time for Cal to take him back to the county seat, and to stand trial there in a case where he'd be most sure to be convicted. Mighty tough for a man used to so much freedom. Cal stood by him during the trial. It didn't last long, and Blackie was sent up for from 2 to 14 years. But the months of freedom that Cal was responsible for before the trial done much more to turn Blackie against being careless with other stock than the prison sentence ever could. It was a month or so afterwards when, with the rodeo contracts over with, Brad and Red and Jim returned with the Buckers and Longhorns. Then the late fall works had to be rushed into, and there was no sparing of Brad and Red to go Mustang running and trying to get Colonel right then, nor for quite a spell. But it was figured it was just as well, because Colonel couldn't be caught anyway, and he'd most likely return of his own accord when the heavy snows come and winter set in, the same as he had the year before. Virginia was very glad that he was branded. But one look at that now alert, wise, and confident long-legged brown colt at the edge of the Badlands would have been plenty to scatter all such hopes of his ever coming back to the ranch of his own accord, regardless of weather. Now, 2.5 years old, he was far from the same colt of the year before. As to toughness, his hide was still thin, but he'd got so he could take bumps and stand most any ordinary weather in fair shape. He'd got to handling them long legs of his mighty well too, near as good as Charo in the rough country, and to very much more advantage on the halfway level kind. His so early experiences with lions, wild studs, poison waters, and the mighty dangers of the Badlands and wild horse country had left a mighty deep impression in him, especially with him being so young and green at the time, also strange and out of his line of breeding. With him being that way, them experiences had struck him much deeper than it would of with a colt, born and raised there and of the wild horse blood. He'd benefited according to that. He hadn't forgot and never would, and with other happenings that followed on now and again, with his second year of wild freedom, he was more ready and able to compete with 'em. Through all of that, he wouldn't have had a better teacher and partner than the natural wise little Charo. He couldn't have lived through that first summer without him. But then again, if it hadn't been for Charo, he'd never ventured into the Badlands and the wild horse country. He'd have stayed with the saddle horses in the pasture, and if he had hit out, he'd never gone any further than the horse range, if that far. He'd been easy to ride up to and catch any time. The range horses wouldn't have run much, and so he wouldn't got that idea into his head to start running and go to outdistancing everything in sight. So, as it was, little Charo had been the one to lead him astray from the well-beaten trail to the rough wild horse country amongst renegades, and teached him all the tricks, as well as how to take care of himself. But if Colonel held that against his little partner, or was ashamed of his actions in any way, he anything but showed it. Instead, he'd got to take pride of being amongst the wild ones, rolling in the dirt, do all as they did, and how he could beat 'em to leaving a rider in the distance. He was something like a petted and starched youngster who'd broke loose from his maid's holt, got out of her sight, and went to mixing with a bunch of rollicking rowdies, all strange, some wild and dangerous, but along with a lot of freedom, danger and fun, no low mischieving or harm doing. With his teachings and wisdom from the wild ones, Colonel had got more sure of himself, more bold, for he'd got to sense danger and know what he'd be getting into before it was too late, and Charo, now past 2 years old, had also added on more wisdom to his natural wild instinct. There was no more dodging of strange wild bunches, and the two together made most grown studs of such bunches hesitate, some before diving into 'em. Some wouldn't, and when others got too tough, Colonel could now easy outdistance 'em. Charo would wisely dodge. All was going fine with Colonel. He was the king of all he surveyed, when it come to speed, and he knew it, and when that fall come, then cold, snow-packing winds hit his rump, he didn't no more think of the ranch, the warm stable, and good hay there. That had also got to be of the past, and near as distant as the blue grass meadows where he was born, and like in cahoots with him to make it more easy, that fall didn't come fast and furious as the fall before had. He'd got a chance to grow a better coat of hair, and then the winter that set in was so mild as compared to the one before that it was hardly noticed. There was no steady cold, but many warmer spells, and the snow didn't come near so deep. There was times when it would melt so considerable bare ground would show. Colonel and Charo drifted on to a new and lower range for that winter, where there was more grass and less snow. And in their drifting, they'd joined in with a small stud bunch for more company. The stud of that bunch hadn't offered to put up much of a fight. He was a kind of a good-natured jughead, which is sometimes found amongst all breeds of horses, and it was a wonder how he'd got a hold of his harem of mares and fillies, or how come some other stud hadn't taken 'em away from him. Anyway, he had 'em. Colonel and Charo didn't raise no ruckus, and all went well. And now, when some other bunch was met and a fighting stud would come out to challenge, there'd be 3 out to meet him. And after sizing up the situation, he'd usually only shake his head and turn back to his bunch again. In all the drifting and country that Colonel and Charo had covered during the summer past, and now the winter on, they hadn't come across either of the 2 renegade saddle horses they'd run with the fall before, hadn't seen no sign of 'em. Maybe them 2 wise ones had got weak and poor during the hard winter past and had been caught. Many bunches of wild ones had been caught since that time, for there'd been more Mustang runners come to that country than ever before. It could be noticed that the wild ones had thinned down considerable in numbers, and where 8 or 10 bunches could have been seen in one day's ride the year before, there now was only maybe 3 or 4 of the wisest, wildest, and fastest ones left. And one day, during the middle of the winter, the 2 renegade saddle horses did show up. Charo had been the first one to spot 'em, sunning themselves on the side of a tall butte. Then the stud spotted 'em, and as he started out to meet 'em, Charo and Colonel followed him. The palaver with them and the stud was short, no trouble there, and as he started back for his bunch, the colts soon renewed their acquaintance with the geldings again, and as they also started back for the bunch, the 2 wise ones sort of tagged along too. It was now a sort of mixed-up harem the old stud had, but all got along well, and now, with the added wisdom of the 2 renegades, it would have took some powerful outside stud to have come in and tried to take away any of the mares or fillies out of that bunch. That was tried a few times as the bunch drifted and grazed over the range, but with no success, and a couple of the challenging studs hightailed it back to their bunches much faster than they'd come out, glad to be still altogether, outside of being short some hide and fur after the meeting was over. Then one day there come a fiery young stud. He had a nice little bunch of mares, Just a few, but he'd fought hard and well to whip out the stud that had had him. That young stud had had quite a few fights afterwards in order to hold his little bunch, and coming out victorious each time, he felt pretty cocky, and to figuring there wasn't a stud he couldn't whip, and now ambitious to conquer some more and add on to his harem. At the same time, he kept watch for a likely bunch to whip the stud out and away from, and then haze the bunch in with his own. That's usually quite an undertaking for a stud that already has a bunch, for the mares of the whipped ruler have their own ideas and might try to decide against the new one. They'd cause him a lot of trouble and would need a lot of hazing before they go his way and do as he wished, but there's nothing more ferocious in both looks and actions than a hazing stallion. He won't stand for no argument and gets plenty rough, and sooner or later the mares do as he wishes, whether they like it or him or not. But the trouble is not all over even then, for after acquiring the new bunch, there's the job of putting him in with the bunch he already has, and neither sides will agree to that, not for quite a spell, and until the stallion does quite a bit more subduing and strong persuading. There's jealousy and fighting between the two bunches, and the stallion has to set that right too. That takes quite a while, but after some hide is peeled off the orneriest one's rumps and a few swift kick sets 'em to behaving and agreeing, there's very little more trouble. The job is done. The harem is together, and now all there is to watch out for is that some other stallion doesn't come along and tries to spoil it all. It's a mystery as to how much power and endurance a wild stallion can have at them times. Such a big job may be no more than done when, if necessary, and another challenging stallion comes along. He's ready to dig right in and go it all over again, like never tiring. Such an undertaking is just what the fiery young stud was going to try that day, to conquer and add on more mares to his harem. He was fresh and bold and mighty, warrior-like, as he left his small bunch to stand and came on the separating distance of about 500 yards to challenge and meet the good-natured old stud of the bunch Colonel Charo and the two renegades was with. The sleepy-acting old stud watched the showy younger one come for a ways, then he sort of woke up, shook his heavy-maned neck, and trotted out to meet him. The colts and renegades tagged along, this time more like to watch the fun than to join in the battle. The mares stayed where they was and just watched. It seems like there's no age limit as to a wild stallion's strength and fighting ability. The older they get, the wickeder and more dangerous they are. Their hide and muscles seem to get tougher, and even though sometimes, after losing their teeth, can easy enough whip young husky studs. This good-natured acting older stud showed the marks of many battles. He'd won more than he'd lost, and he'd learned that no matter how good he might be, there was always some that could be still better. That was one thing the younger stallion hadn't as yet learned. Leaving their bunches the way they did, to meet in the center was something like two boxers leaving their corners. For the center of the ring, the two stallions, one going easy but confident, and the other bold and showy, was like some boxers as they size up while coming for one another and then meet. But there was no sparring as the two stallions met. They came on and clashed, and there was no clinching afterwards either. Like all fighters, wild stallions each have their own style of fighting. The younger one came on with knees up and forward like a man using his elbows. That was to bump his opponent off balance, so's to get past his head and fasten his teeth along his neck or throat. The older one came on, head up, and as though to meet that, but he, of a sudden, wasn't there when the young one rushed, so all bent to exterminate him right quick. His knees couldn't find him. Instead, he found himself sailing along the slope of his shoulder, lifted off the ground, then a sharp pain of tearing hide along his flank. That's where the older one's head had ducked to and get for to gut him. That was one of his styles of fighting, and before the younger one had slid on past him and got his balance, that older one turned and fastened his powerful jaws on the back of the younger one's neck, paralyzing and dazing him. The fight didn't last long after that. Quicker than the eye could see, and while the younger one was still dazed, the older one switched holts, this time to the back of his jaw and at his throat. It was a wonder he didn't rip it wide open, and all that saved the young stallion there was that he'd been hit too hard and he went down. A horse doesn't hang on to his holt when the other is up, and as the younger one went down, out of wind, the older one let go, stomped him on the neck a couple of times, dazing him some more. He showed no more interest in him after that. He raised his head high, let out a snorting nicker of victory, and then his attention went to the younger stud's mares that was still standing where they'd been left. He shook his heavy maned neck and trotted towards 'em, and there wasn't even a soft how-to-do nicker as he came near. He just proudly circled around 'em a couple of times, then he curved his neck down, held his head straight, level to within a few inches of the ground, and ears back, eyes full of fire, made a mighty wicked-looking sight, the likes of which reminds mustang runners of a powerful snake ready to strike. The mares knew that threatening sign. It was time for them to move, and that little bunch didn't want to argue with that wicked one, for they'd seen him in action. The mares was hazed past their fallen ruler and on to join the victor's bunch. That was the result of the battle, the younger cocksure warrior losing all instead of acquiring more, besides being badly chewed and gashed up. But he'd got off lucky even at that. He was still alive. The gashes would heal, and he'd soon enough come back to fighting mood again. Try to whip some other stud out of his bunch, and now all the wiser as to how to go about it. He wouldn't leave himself wide open again when he'd rush and depend altogether on his strength and weight as he had. The older stud didn't try to move his now good-sized bunch on after he'd hazed in the new appropriated mares. He just stayed out to one side of 'em and lapped crusted snow while keeping an eye on his opponent, which now had raised his head and would soon be up, for he might want to go on with the battle, as some do, and try to get his harem back, and the older stud was prepared in case he did, but there was no such intentions in the younger one's mind. Right then, as he struggled up to his feet, and as he got a glimpse of the older one starting after him again, there was no more show of warrior about him. He done his best to get away as fast as he could, and his legs, even though shaky, was still good. The old stud hazed him out on his way, just to make sure, and then returned to his bunch. The sleepy-looking good-natured old stud had more than surprised the two wise renegades, and gave Colonel and Charo something to watch out for when it come to fighting. in that battle he'd of a sudden won their admiration and respect. They wasn't to be fooled by his sleepy look and easygoing ways no more. But as it goes, that no matter how good one may be, there's always another, just as good or still better, that went on to be proved some time later. Before then there come a few skirmishes with Mustang runners, and there was where the two wise renegades came in and done more than their share to help lead the bunch from hard runs, traps, and to clean getaways. For a spell, and figuring the wild ones to be weak from the first warm days of the coming spring, Mustangers got to pop up here and there pretty often, but there was too many wise heads steady a-watching in the old stud's bunch for it to be rode up onto unawares, and that bunch, having been on good range all winter, was far from being weak at the first sight of a mustanger or of some other running bunch, showing there was one near. The renegades would lead on for the roughest. A country they'd know well, and where they would soon vanish from sight. When the spell of mustanger skirmishes was over for the time, and the bunch got to grazing more at ease again, only a few of the mares was missing, some that was too heavy with foal to go on, and others young rattle-brained fillies of the age when they think they're too smart to follow the lead of the wise ones. But even with that loss there was still a fair-sized bunch kept together. When spring really did come, melting snows, leaving puddles and pools of water in many places, and with bunch grass greening up on the rough hillsides and hollows, it was while enjoying this peace and plenty of springtime one day that a tornado in the shape of a regular devil horse hit the bunch with no warning and scattered it from there to yonder. The old stud had been the first one hit and bowled over. The two renegades lost some hide in getting away, and by that time Colonel and Charo had been wise enough to skedaddle away from there quick. Right smack on top of that, and going right on, the mares was slam-banged into a quick run, hazed over a ridge, and out of sight, while the scattered remaining ones could only look on, trying to get their wits together. It all happened so sudden that none realized at the time what was really happening, and when they finally come to, looking at one another, like to take count on how many of 'em was left, and if all in one piece, they felt sort of confused, for that devil horse must have been part thunderbolt as well as tornado, the way he was everywhere at once, and done his work so quick and smooth. The two renegades had seen many battles and much scattering of bunches, but never like this one, and looking at the old stud down below him, standing and just looking around some, he was also like wondering what had happened, but seemed none the worse for what did happen. It had been too sudden, and now, counting noses, there was only 5 of 'em left, kinda scattered as yet, but they got together again and began drifting, some, for none felt like grazing for a spell, and Colonel, having never witnessed anything like that before, was spooky and still wide-eyed at the suddenness and of what all it had been about. As the small bunch drifted, old Stud lagged on behind, like wondering which way to go, for he wasn't satisfied to be with only the geldings and the colts. He'd rather be alone for a spell, but he did drift along with 'em for a ways and grazed with 'em for a spell, until the dark of that night come. Then after a short rest he started out, alone. He'd ramble on and take it easy for some days, maybe weeks. By that time he'd be on his summer range, where few mustangers ever bothered him, and there he'd in time find a likely bunch with a stud he could whip out, and then all would be at peace again, excepting for, as usual, watching out for other studs and other things a wild stallion has to steady keep watch for.